Back, everybody, to our second panel titled The Academics. What we will focus on in this panel is we will focus on three questions. We will look at what went wrong with Facebook. Why did so much go wrong with Facebook? We will look at the legal and the social framework in which Facebook is operating. And third, and this is where I want to spend most of the time of this panel, we will look at what we can do about that. With that, I mean, what policy recommendations do our panelists have? What legal changes should we enact? Or what other sorts of changes might be promising? My name is Nicholas Guggenberger. I am the executive director of the Yale Information Society Project, and it is my great pleasure to welcome such an excellent panel here. We will go in alphabetical order. That is Jack Balkin, who is the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School and the director of the Information Society Project. We have David Kaye, also already appeared, a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. We have Nate Persley, who is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, dialing in from California. And last but certainly not least, we have Zephyr Teachout, Associate Professor of Law at Fordham Law School. Now, again, the three questions I want to focus on in this panel are: what went wrong with Facebook? What is wrong with the social and legal framework in which Facebook is operating? And what should we do about it? Jack, why don't you kick us off with a short introductory statement?
Fine. I'm going to actually combine the first two of your questions, if you don't mind, just so you save time. And I was to make four very basic points. First, what went wrong with Facebook is largely caused by law. Many different types of law, as they've developed since the 1980s. Antitrust law, intellectual property law, the law of freedom of expression, the law of interoperability. So many different forms of law conspire to create the kind of political economy we now have. The second thing is, if you noticed in the previous panel, much of the discussion was about virality and choices that Facebook could or could not have made. It was internal, in other words, to Facebook's design choices. It focused on what Facebook could have done if it wanted to. But I think the key lesson that we've drawn from this current controversy is that self-regulation simply doesn't work. So that we can try to persuade Facebook to do things better, but in fact, ultimately, self-regulation turns out to be no regulation at all. The third point is that when we regulate, which I think is now just necessary, you actually have to aim at changing the underlying business models of these companies. That's because there is an inherent conflict of interest between the current business models of companies like Facebook and the health of the digital public sphere. And then finally, whatever regulations you choose, and we're going to talk about that later in this panel, you can't pick regulations that allow Facebook to consolidate its current competitive position and keep in place its current methods of making money.
Thank you for that, Jack. And I will hand it over right to David. David, in your view, building on your work, drawing from your work, but also based on what you have learned over the last couple of days through the revelations, what went wrong with Facebook? Where does it come from? And where should we go?
Great, Nick. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's really great, especially to follow Professor Jack Balkin, who's made such an impact on this field. I mean, I would say a couple of things. First is, Facebook and all of the platforms, and I think it's useful to talk about all the platforms, not just one. They've all grown in this massive, very quick way, and particularly in some environments around the world, which is where I focus. I tend to focus on the impact of social media in different countries, markets, jurisdictions, whatever you want to call them, around the world. They expanded so rapidly into these different markets, and they were popular. It's not like it was necessarily this entry that they forced, although we could talk a little bit about that, but they became very popular. Didn't understand. They didn't understand the context. They didn't understand the languages. They didn't have the tools in order to gain that kind of understanding. And I think that led and has really caused a significant number of problems around the world. That's also been a factor in the United States and in Europe and in many other places. The rules were very slow to develop. The processes for applying those rules, as Kate Klonick has shown, took a while to develop as well. There's been a lack of transparency. So many of the debates around the platforms are rooted in a lack of knowledge about the platforms themselves. And there's also been a failure to engage some really fantastic ideas that academics and civil society have proposed over the years. I think all of those kind of combine to create the situation that we're in.
Thank you, David. And Nate, I just see in the chat that nothing went wrong with Facebook because it made shareholders rich. What's your take? Did something go wrong with Facebook?
Well, my take is certainly not that one. So look, it depends which problem we want to identify here, right? So one of the important features of the revelations from this week and the heroism of Frances Gauguin is that it wasn't just one issue that she was revealing, it was a whole suite of issues, right? So depending on who you are, you either think the problem with Facebook is violations of privacy, or maybe it's the antitrust sort of market dominance, consolidation, or you think it's content policy, and even within that, is it disinformation, is it hate speech, is it incitement to violence, is it teenage self-harm, right? That's a lot of problems, right? And they're not all amenable to the same solution, and they don't all come from the same cause. But there are certain features, and some of this is I think, internet generally, and I want to echo what David just said, that it is remarkable that, these problems that have been revealed are ones that all of these large platforms that are based on advertising and engagement necessarily are encountering, right? And and you've already had a panel talking about the business model, so I don't want to sort of repeat that, but let's not forget that these are advertising companies with social media features added onto them, or search features and the like, or video sharing. So start with that. Now, the problem from my perspective, right, is thinking about the impact of these companies on democracy, since I work in that area. And, part of the challenges I think we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years are that there are aspects of the internet itself, in addition to unique problems of these platforms as monopolies, that are posing unique challenges to democracy. Some of that was covered in the previous panel, the virality, velocity and volume, I often say, right? The speed at which information travels, the fact that it's done through peer-to-peer transfer, which privileges outrage and other kinds of emotions, and the sheer amount of information that we have in our pockets with our cell phones. Beyond that, there's also other features that have often been seen as the great virtues of the internet, things like protecting anonymity, which we see as being a real cause for concern, because it ends up shielding people when they engage in hate speech, or shielding bots when bots are used to manipulate elections and the like. But beyond that, and I'll just end here since we have a lot to cover, there is the monopoly power of these platforms and the fact that they are global in scope. And the global issue is something I want us to come back to. David Kaye is really, the world expert on this. But thinking about how a multinational corporation that is in charge of the speech environment operates, I think poses really unique challenges.
Thank you so much. We'll certainly come back to the global dimension and to the impact on democracy. But before we do that, Zephyr, what do you make out of the situation?
Wow, well, thank you for letting me be part of this extraordinary double panel. I was riveted in the first panel. Thank you. I largely agree with what Jack has said, and I just want to put a few points on it. We have a real crisis of democracy that flows from radical failures in antitrust law, both in enforcement and in ideology, failures in Section 230, failures in criminal law, which we haven't touched on, but I do want to touch on, failures in business law, our inability to imagine that we can regulate business models. And all of these have been the sort of meta failure is a categorization of antitrust, criminal law, Section 230, and business law as consumer welfare problems instead of democratic problems. And while we spent the last panel talking about the toxic, unhealthy, and dangerously violent features of the business model, I just want to point out, as a matter of democracy, how crazy our current situation is. We have two gatekeepers, Google and Facebook, that are responsible, are the gatekeepers for the vast majority of news that people in America read. And I'm going to talk, I'll be the Americanist voice here. You would never design a democracy with two private gatekeepers, whatever their business model was, who have the ability to lift up or lift down the Cleveland Plain dealer at their whim. It is dangerous because it creates a dependency, which creates both sycophancy and fear. Great credit to Francis for speaking out against that fear. A deep instability that comes when you have concentrations of power, and a deeply dangerous democratic system where you have two gatekeepers who decide what is newsworthy and what is not, whatever their business model. The other context we haven't talked about is that the business model, so think of these as infrastructural, private infrastructure with we've never had communications infrastructure that has this particular dangerous business model. So you have it both concentrated and infrastructure with targeted ads. Like if you imagine buses having the targeted ads business model, you would spend your time getting on the bus, and the bus's job would be to make sure you stayed on the bus as long as possible instead of getting where you wanted to go. And maximizing conflict, as we now know, instead of focusing on your exact needs. But what I guess the thing that I want to underline is it's bad in that way, but it's also bad because it's actually stealing from journalism itself. So it's a business model with a gatekeeper that is not just lifting up dangerous content, but has been part of the second wave destruction of the funding for news organizations. The first wave destruction comes with the internet itself, but the second wave destruction comes with the double gatekeepers. And these are not facts of nature. And then finally, I think the other context, and I sort of alluded to this, is that I think the other context is an ongoing crisis of the rule of law around elite enforcement. So while we are talking about failures of antitrust enforcement, we also have a recent lawsuit, not a great surprise, alleging that insiders dumped stock after the Cambridge, right before the Cambridge Analytica scandal went public. We have strong evidence that enforcers have been looking the other way on fraud claims, on a whole series of price fixing claims. There's new lawsuits in this arena. And so even with existing laws, there's a kind of elite lawlessness, and it is, as Shoshana pointed out, particularly problematic in the area of tech, where there's been a cultural acceptance of tech as so fundamentally different. That's embodied in 230, but also a cultural norm that we shouldn't be interfering with their productive business.
Thank you so much. I already see it will be easy to resolve all these issues within the next 40 minutes or so that we have before we open it up to Q&A, more generally speaking. But since it popped up in the chat, Safir, one question back. Haven't we always had gatekeepers? And what's really new with that? That's a question I'm picking up from the chat.
We have never had gatekeepers at this scale. You've never had, even when you have a handful of broadcasters dominating, they aren't also owning the radio station, controlling the newspapers. In fact, cross ownership has been a sort of core principle. Bans on cross ownership has been a core principle of American communications policy since the founding. You've never had the post office owning the CBS. So while you see particular areas of concentration in gatekeepers, what you are seeing is Google and Facebook being the uber gatekeepers above all of these other different markets. And it is not just a small change, it's a really radical change in the scope of the gatekeeping.
Thank you so much. So let us dive a bit deeper into the issues that you had already mentioned. David, Facebook has changed over time. It has emerged. It has grown. Just to name a couple things, it changed the design of its newsfeed over time. It added features from marketplace to dating. It changed its algorithms that amplify content to create engagement. And over the years, Facebook has expanded into adjacent markets. It grew up to, now it's close to 3 billion monthly active users. When did that company go off the rails, or was it never on rails?
Right, we were kind of joking before about the question itself, because there haven't been rails. I mean, the rails haven't really been in law necessarily, although in some areas that has changed over time. And if we're looking at it globally, we have definitely seen rails emerge in the areas of counterterrorism, of child endangerment, and so forth, sort of, in a way, carve-outs from the general, sort of Section 230 hands-off approach. In other words, companies, the platforms, have the ability to decide what's objectionable material, but there's a couple of carve-outs from that. But I think that if we're thinking about going off the rails, I really think that that what we're looking at is the companies operating in a space where up until the last several years, it wasn't a matter of law that would provide rails. It wasn't even that social movements provide rails. And that's what's changed, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years, right? I mean, really since 2016 or so. And this has been, I mean, as Zephyr was saying, this is a democracy problem, whereas Nada said, these are about platforms and their influence on democracy. There was a kind of sense within all of the platforms that they didn't really have the impact that we all saw that they were having. If you go back and look at Mark Zuckerberg's comments after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, there's kind of this, there's no way that our platform can have that kind of influence, right? It's what's happening out in society. I mean, now we know, and I'm not sure that I fully subscribe to the idea that the platforms, or I don't think you need to fully subscribe to the idea that the platforms are the gatekeepers to media in order to reach the conclusion that whether they're gatekeepers or not, they have this massive influence on democratic space. And I think the rails, the fact of lacking rails is sort of this perception that they had that they really weren't part of the problem, that it was society and their use of the platform that might have been the problem, but they weren't the problem itself. And this replicates in all the markets, all the countries where they operate around the world. Again, not just Facebook, but all the different platforms.
Now, quick follow-up with that. We heard Jack earlier say that the digital monopolies are really built on law. Isn't that type of law, isn't that rails maybe the wrong tracks? Or is it rather that we have a situation in which there are really no rails and platforms basically just go wherever they want to go?
Well, I mean, I think that they're driven in some ways by a desire for growth. And if you look at their operations overseas in particular, and it's really important to do that because Facebook, with its 2 billion users, 90% of those users are outside the United States. And in many of those countries, there really isn't a legal framework that puts any real rails on their content moderation and so forth. Now that's changed in the last several years, where you've seen particularly authoritarian governments basically say, if you don't take down this certain content that is, say, critical of government, we're going to fine you, or we're going to arrest your employees here. You also see the development of rules in places like Germany with its Network Enforcement Act that has tried to create rules. But I would say generally, globally, the creation of rails, of rules, has been a more recent innovation for them.
Thank you very much. And Zephyr, I would like to get back to you. So the revelations by Frances Haugen had stirred up a debate, undoubtedly, have created enormous attention. But at the same time, to many in the fields, on substance, these things weren't necessarily surprising. And In the same vein, we have discussed the Cambridge Analytica scandal for about 3 years now. We've had various commissions in various jurisdictions, numerous reports, and the level of sophistication of these reports and commissions has significantly grown between the infamous exchange between Mark Zuckerberg and Chuck Grassley to the incredibly sophisticated competition report by Cicilline and his team. What are the roadblocks that are holding us back? What's slowing down change or preventing change?
Well, the good news is I actually think as a matter of public support, there's extraordinary public support, and it's bipartisan, for dealing with the massive concentrations of power and conflicts of interest in big tech. And right now there are bipartisan bills in the House that, for instance, would ban self-dealing and stop mergers, led by Congressman Cicilline. And I got to tell you, it's really clear where the roadblock is. It's lobbying money. So it's not that people in districts are saying don't act on this. It's that when you have 50 lobbyists sort of roaming the halls and making arguments, and they're making arguments about slowness and complication. So there's a very clear money problem. But I have real confidence this is going to move forward at the federal level and at the state level. In New York State, we have an exciting new general purpose antitrust law that passed the Senate. So when I think at an ideological level where the roadblocks are, what are the kinds of arguments these lobbyists are making to say, no, we should be able to merge with anybody, or we should be allowed to engage in self-dealing? Just be alert to a lot of the language of confusion and complication. Basically, if you mess up, if you get involved here, the economy will come crashing down. Or something very similar to what economists have done over the last 40 years. This is too complicated for the public to understand. And so a de-democratization of antitrust in particular has been a 40-year project. This is not for the little people. This is for the economists. Don't engage here. And that is very much a central part of the lobbyist argument. And then on tech, a variation of that is, this is, we'll ruin the internet, but we know we need regulation. Let's just be careful. It's too complicated. I see real movement there. I think the other roadblock, honestly, is that we as a culture have to understand that a lot of what these companies are doing is criminal. And that's an old understanding. So these are sort of framework. I think we now understand it's a democratic problem. People, everybody understand, not everybody, more and more people understand that. But starting to see, like the Sherman Act, which is a criminal statute, that violating antitrust is a breach of the public, like other forms of theft. If we can get back to that, and I do think Francis's sort of powerful whistleblowing and testimony helps us get there, that this is a public wrong. This isn't just a sort of a little technical issue over here. I think once we can get to the level of anger, so that we have not consensus, but growing movement, getting over that big money and reframing this in criminal law terms, I think will help a lot.
Thank you so much, Zephyr. You mentioned two things. You mentioned gatekeepers earlier on and their role, and you mentioned democracy as a value that got lost in antitrust, but potentially beyond that. Nate, I want to get to you. You have also mentioned democratic discourse on which you work and on which you have worked for a long time. What does it mean for democratic discourse, for cultural discourse, if a significant part of that discourse has to go through one or two or a few bottlenecks?
Well, it does mean that the rules that are in place, whether it's terms of service or algorithmic prioritization, right, have outsized effect on what people are going to see, and so it becomes quite important. But I don't know if pump the brakes is the right word, but I want to be modest here about what we know and what we don't know. And that's part of the problem here, because it's not just that these are economic monopolies, right? These are data monopolies, right? They have the information about the harms that are alleged against them. And so one of the reasons that this has been such a revelatory week, right, or month since the Wall Street Journal started publishing, is that we get some window into studies that are internal that we otherwise wouldn't see. And so, as you know, I've been spending so much time trying to get data out of Facebook and other firms, and have proposed legislation actually that I'll just put in the chat here. But that's the bottom line. When you start saying, well, how is this affecting discourse? How is it affecting people's beliefs, attitudes, behaviors? We have some ideas, and again, the revelations this week are helpful. But we really don't know, because the data that the internal folks in the companies have is not available to the rest of us. I will say, though, that like we were talking about before, there is a kind of critical question about the role of virality and privileging of engagement, even if it's meaningful engagement, and then what types of content are privileged over others. Let me say one last thing, if I haven't filibustered enough here, which is the other theme, of course, of Frances Haugen's testimony, and as well as the book, The Ugly Truth, is how if only it weren't for the economic motives of these platforms, then they could solve these problems, which is to say they're putting profit ahead of safety and other things. So, and that is something I've heard, not just obviously from folks on the outside, but even people inside Facebook and then who have left. For the most part, the people I have dealt with at Facebook, I see different or additional obstacles, right? And that is that particularly during the last 5 years with respect to the Trump administration, they were, and this continues to this day, they were extremely unwilling or hesitant to try to take sides, to do things in whether it's algorithmically or through content moderation that would have a disparate effect on the political right. And so that leads to a system in which you cannot distinguish between the New York Times and Breitbart, right? Because they don't want to be in that business. There's an economic side to this too, about being afraid of retaliation, right, from the president line. And that's a big challenge, right? Because if you adopt that view, which is that they don't want to be arbiters of truth, they don't want to adopt policies that have a clear disparate impact, that's going to be a challenge. The second sort of prong of that is to go back to the international scope of what they're doing. So when they think about content moderation and algorithmic prioritization and the like in, say, a Donald Trump or US context, they have to think about it in a Modi context, a Bolsonaro context, as well as everywhere else, often where they don't have the local expertise and people on the ground and the like. But that is a paralyzing decision or context for a decision to be made, right? Where it prevents to think about the implications of one speech regulation in a particular country and then how that's going to be rolled out globally.
Thank you. We will have a hard time coming up with 60 votes to break a filibuster on that panel.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I would like to move directly to the remedies. And I would like to bring in David here. David, speech, expression, and access to information, those are all, and depending, of course, on the jurisdiction, but globally, generally considered human rights. What can the human rights discourse contribute to the situation that we're in at the moment? What can it contribute to making online discourse better, less toxic, especially for adolescents?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there are maybe two ways to think about this particular question. So one is human rights offers substantive rules, I mean, basically frameworks for thinking about we can call it the moderation of content, but the way to think about how public authorities or authorities in general deal with content that is in some way or another problematic. So there's two particular rules that I would point to. Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects everyone against interference that's arbitrary and unlawful, interference with privacy. And it also requires governments to protect individuals against third-party interferences of privacy. So there's a kind of a human rights element to privacy that is global, that isn't just a question of what does US law say, but it's what individuals around the world, that is the billions of users of these platforms, have a right to. The other is on speech, is that Article 19 of that same covenant protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And it provides a 3-part test for how you evaluate the potential for limiting expression. And that 3-part test is one that resonates around the world. And it says basically that your restrictions need to be provided by law, so they need to have a kind of precision. They need to meet a test of necessity and proportionality, and they need to be guided towards or intended to protect a particular interest, not just some generic, but it's cumulative, and it requires, I would say, a massive power like the platforms to create this kind of rule-based restriction. Now, this is law that applies to states. It doesn't necessarily apply to companies directly. However, in parallel with the growth of the platforms over the last 15 years, there's also been the growth of something known as the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. And these guiding principles that were adopted by the Human Rights Council about 10 years ago, they basically say to companies, not just tech companies, but companies in all fields, that if you're going to have an impact on human rights, you need to do human rights impact assessment. You need to evaluate what kinds of human rights harms your product may cause when you release them. And you should do that, wherever that harm may exist. And so I think that if you connect those rules, human rights impact assessment, and maybe the possibility of both transparency and also government requirements that companies, in the way that we ask companies involved in the environment to adopt environmental impact statements, they should also adopt human rights impact assessments. And that could be a part of bringing those harms to light, the kinds of harms that we see in the documents that have been released over the last few weeks. Those should have been released in a different sort of way as part of a regulatory mandated disclosure process. And I think that kind of connects your human rights to, sort of basic regulatory process.
Nate, David mentioned transparency as one of the concerns. Now, you have come out with an op-ed the other day and with a suggestion for a Platforms Transparency and Accountability Act that you thankfully dropped here in the chat. Can you tell us a bit more about that initiative, what it's about, what its goals are, and maybe also what its limits are?
Sure. So as a lot of people know who are here, I've been working for about 4 or 5 years on this project called Social Science One, which was an attempt to try to get data out of Facebook and in the hands of the research community. We met with, limited success, and I should say, although we ended at, there are serious errors in the data. I have an announcement today, which is that those errors have finally been corrected today. But even the data that we received was really not, the gold mine that we had hoped we would have had at the beginning. And I became convinced that the only way to get what is necessary in order to have the type of transparency that we want is government regulation. And so I spent a lot of time over the last year working with lawyers to write that piece of legislation that I put in the chat. What it would do is empower the FTC to require the platforms to turn over data for independent researchers in rooms that are under the platform's control. We don't want the data, just being dumped on the public. Some of this is obviously quite sensitive and and we don't want the government to have access to it. But we do need some kind of independent group of researchers who will be able to see the same things that the data scientists on the inside are able to see, right? And obviously the privacy issues are real, and the legislation spends a lot of time trying to deal with them, and the FTC has to put those front and center. Ideally, this would be passed as a larger privacy bill. Having said all that, we cannot live in the world where we are currently sort of waiting for the few Frances Haugans of the world to reveal some of the internal research and data, right? That's unsustainable. We have to move toward a world where there's some other independent authority that has access to the data that the data scientists have. And while there are serious privacy concerns that have to be taken into account, it's not as if the researchers it's not as if the data will not be analyzed. The question is whether it's only the people inside the firm who are going to have access to this data. And we need to figure out some way have a check on the outside. And just to be one final point, which is that the legislation in order to provide researcher access is not like a luxury gift for pointy-headed academics, right? It is a way of controlling the behavior of the companies because they will know that they're being watched, and it will provide information that will lead to hopefully sound policy, right? Because right now legislators are legislating in the dark.
Thank you very much. So we have heard about human rights standards, application to content moderation. We have heard a lot about transparency. Jack, I want to get to you. You have suggested a three-prong list for broader reforms that you think are necessary on substance. Can you tell us a bit more? What are those three prongs and how far do they get us?
I wanted to begin by just noticing that although we've emphasized democracy as the primary thing we're worried about, there are more things at stake, and they have to do with the different reforms we might suggest. And the reason why is most people just don't talk about politics online. They talk about a lot of things, but much of it is not politics. So we're worried not only about democracy, we're worried about public health. We're worried about bodily security, for example, problems of ethnic violence and genocide. We're worried about privacy. We're worried about consumer protection. And above all, we're worried about manipulation. So when we are trying to design reforms, we have to consider all of these values as well as democracy. Democracy is very important too, I should just say. Another thing we have to think about, this follows on what David has talked about. I'm going to talk primarily about things that can be done in the United States, but it's really important to ask yourself, how will reforms in the United States or in Europe affect what happens in other countries? Will it be better or worse? Now, a lot of people know about the Brussels effect of European regulation on business and also digital businesses around the world. The problem is we haven't had a US effect other than just libertarianism, other than you can do whatever you want. An interesting question would be whether or not reforms in the United States would actually create a US effect that would have benefits. And it's an interesting question. It might help, it might hurt. But anyway, here are the ways in which we might get involved. The first set of reforms would all be antitrust and competition. Horizontal, let's have 50 Facebooks, not just one. Vertical, let's not have Facebook and Google both be the major digital advertising brokers in the world and also competitors with other media companies. Let's break them up vertically as well as horizontally. And let's also have interoperability, which can help to deal with the problem of network effects. If you don't do anything about network effects, then your 50 little Facebooks soon turn into one big Facebook again. And having 50 little Facebooks mean you'll have a lot of experimentation. You'll have different kinds of content moderation practices. You'll have different kinds of affordances. And in fact, it may well be that Facebook is offering an inferior service, both in terms of its privacy, its content moderation, and so many other things, just because there's just so few competitors. If you had 50 Facebooks, you'd have something better. The second tranche of basic reforms are privacy and consumer protection. And as Nate pointed out, the transparency issues will be tied to both of these types of reforms. I have my own theory of information fiduciaries, which I can talk about more if people want, but the basic idea is simply that the purpose of these privacy and consumer protection laws is to require businesses to take the interests of end users into account every bit as much as they take the interest of advertisers and their own interests. One important thing we can borrow from the Europeans is privacy by design, which will affect not only privacy, but also friction and virality. And then finally, the last tranche of reforms concern intermediary immunity and intermediary liability. There's been an enormous amount of debate about what to do about Section 30, and I have my views about it, but the simple idea I want to promote here is simply, we should keep Section 230, but use it as a lever. That is, it's a regulatory subsidy we're offering large companies, and in return, they'll do something for us. We should use it to impose public interest obligations on these companies, including transparency along the lines that Nate has suggested, the ability to inspect algorithms, and also my idea of fiduciary duties. So if you take any of these ideas that I've just suggested, competition law, privacy and consumer protection law, reform of intermediary immunity, each of them could make things a little better. If we did all of them or managed to do most of them, it might make things a lot better.
Thank you. I get the impression that we need to overcome a few more filibusters. Zephyr, who but you could I ask about horizontal disaggregation, vertical disaggregation? You've written a book titled Break 'em Up. What do you envisage? So if we enacted everything that you lay out, and maybe you can go in a little more detail how that would play out in practice, what would happen?
I think Jack just did a pretty good job. He covered a lot of spheres, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it. And I want to add one harm to the list of harms that Jack rightly re-raised. For years, we were fighting to say this is also a democracy issue. And here we're on 2 panels that fully embrace it. And that's a big deal. That's a really, that's important. But the one thing I do want to add is the inequality harms. And what you see, for instance, just one small example in the New York and FTC complaints against Facebook and digital advertising is how they're extracting from small business owners for a very low quality service. And that is affecting communities around the country, around the world, because they can charge exorbitant, unfair rates because they are a monopoly, or as a recent case said, a colossal enterprise assured of handsome dividends by the possession of a monopoly may rest well upon its position, knowing that however the country may suffer from its exactions, its own profits are secure. That was just from 1859. So that is a pre-Sherman Act case, a long-standing understanding of corporate and then later antitrust law that these are monopolies are major drivers of inequality. So the other thing I want to say about the vision I'm about to lay out is if we want significant changes in the business model, which we need to have. I've advocated for banning surveillance advertising as well. Significant total limits on what data one can extract. To get there, you need to, as Tristan suggests, problematize the coordination ease of Facebook and make it easier for the critics to organize. And that's what antitrust does. It makes it harder for capital to get together. So when we have 50 different, what we might call Facebooks, and I think when we think of that, we're thinking the social media platform, because Facebook is 93 different companies, Google is 250. But when we say Facebook, our shorthand is typically social media, as when we say Google, our shorthand is typically search, not YouTube or all the other. So say you have 50 different social media that do not also own Messenger and do not also own digital advertising and are interoperable. Then what you have is, this is the way that we've organized communications infrastructure in the past. And so it's plausible, it's not that hard, but it is not getting rid of Facebook. The other things so that was a discussion, again, Jack did a really good job. It's both horizontal and vertical. And the vertical is key. That it's so often it's the vertical that is used to leverage and maintain monopoly power. And again, you find these are old concepts that you find in the 19th century corporate law cases, long before we had antitrust. These conflicts of interest are dangerous because they lead to concentrations of power that threaten self-government. The other things that aren't often thought of along these lines, but I think are really critical, is what we talk about as forced arbitration. There are other modes of concentrating private power that make it hard for us to see what is actually happening. We've just had an amazing whistleblower week. Another way that you get to see what is actually happening is through court cases that are actually in the public. And arbitration has been a central tool of secrecy and enclosure. So I think of arbitration and changes in that area as critical. And then finally, as I've alluded to a few times before, and Roger McNamee, who has a fantastic cover story in Time this week, often says is, we got to bring criminal law to bear. So that if we have short-term and long-term regulatory needs. So in the short term, we've got to be a lot more serious and treat Facebook as an entity that is repeatedly treat Facebook not as, dear Mark, do you support my legislation, which is the nature of the congressional hearing 3 years ago, but we've got somebody who's repeatedly broken the law and is peddling a really dangerous product. Let's actually do a lot of investigations here.
Thank you very much. Before we go over to David and talk about liability rules a bit more, I would like to come back to Nate for a related question. So we have talked about splitting up Facebook, disaggregating it, whether it's horizontally or vertically. Another suggestion that has been floated by some and curiously been promoted on the right is on the political right is the notion of common carriage. Can you tell us a bit more about what common carriage is and how and in what circumstances it could or should be applied to Facebook and potentially other digital platforms?
So Eugene Volokh at UCLA Law School has a very good article on this, but just the fact that you're bringing this up does demonstrate the division between the left and the right on the content moderation questions. And I think that we should, although we seem to be in a period this week where Republicans and Democrats have been united in their hatred to Facebook, it is not the case that when it comes to regulating content that they either perceive the problem the same way or that they think the solutions are the same. And so whereas Democrats tend to think that the big problem is that there's too much hate speech, disinformation, and incitement on the platforms, Republicans tend to think there's too much liberal censorship of conservative voices. And those are irreconcilable positions right now, right? And so the common carriage metaphor and argument, right, can serve two purposes. One is, as would be true with UPS, FedEx, trains and the like, right? It would say, all right, you have to serve all comers, right? Whether they're QAnon folks or the New York Times, right? And you have to treat them the same. And I obviously oppose that, but that's one argument, right? Either constitutionally speaking or through legislation, that legislation can treat them as common carriers. The other is that, all right, well, this is an area where, they are quasi-public utilities where you can do certain kinds of regulations. Let's start treating them more like these other kinds of familiar large infrastructure kind of companies. I think infrastructure was the term that Zephyr used earlier. And so there's that. But I do want to, emphasize that on most of the critical problems that came out in the disclosures this week, the content moderation solution, if it were to be concretized in law, is one that the parties do not accept. There's one big exception here, and that is children, right? And so the Instagram revelations, right, such as they are, and I think there's a lot of conflicting evidence because of what that study was about, but nevertheless, anyone with any parent of child sees what's happening with respect to some of these social media applications. That is where I could see some real action. And Blumenthal and I can't remember who the Republican is who's on the bill with him, right, are going to probably try to pass something with respect to kids. But part of this goes back to one of the kind of core features of the internet I was talking about before, and some of these platforms, which is anonymity, because it's all well and good to oppose something like Instagram Kids, but so long as Instagram exists, then kids will be lying about their age in order to get on it.
Thank you very much. As I understand it, Section 230, which shields platforms from liability, was originally conceived as having the potential to square that circle between enabling as much speech as possible and incentivizing content moderation to some extent.
Can I just say one thing on Section 230, and then I'll shut up, which is that Section 230 has become a metaphor for everything that ails the internet, right? And so when we talk about reform of 230, we throw it in, buckets in there. And we don't need to do that, right? There are plenty of ways, as Zephyr and others on the panel have elucidated, right? There are plenty of ways to regulate these companies, and 230 is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of them. The kind of carrot and stick approach that Jack mentioned, where 230 immunity is tied to other things, I think is good. But remember, 230 applies to the entire internet, right? And so we have to have a different theory about 230 immunity as it applies to large firms than it would to the smaller ones. Otherwise, you'll be in a world where I think competitors are going to have a harder time trying to start up in order to try to challenge some of these established players.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that. So and David, this is where I'd like to bring you in. You have worked within various jurisdictions. Other countries have other approaches. The EU with 14 e-commerce directive and soon the DSA follows a slightly different model that can be compared to a notice and takedown regime. What kind of room for reform do you see? Where do you see what do you perceive to be a sensible push for change? And what do you perceive to be, as Nate called it, piling on and over-focusing on a certain type of lever that we have, but don't necessarily have to use?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think Nate's idea is ideal. I mean, it's a really great approach to open up the platforms so that the public, so that policymakers can understand what it is they need to regulate. I mean, we know from the outside, but most of the discussion to date, and I think this is one of the reasons why people have been so focused on the Facebook files, right? To date, the debate is very much about sort of an asymmetry of information. So on the one hand, researchers, and Nate can tell you this better than anybody alive pretty much, researchers have had a terrible time getting access to data from the companies, particularly from Facebook. And so the asymmetry is that Facebook could say, well, our research doesn't show this, or we don't believe this is true, but they don't give access to researchers to actually do the kind of analysis that would allow a debate where everybody's on the same level. We don't have that. So I'm really supportive of Nate's idea of opening up to researchers. In fact, the Digital Services Act in the European Commission, the one that was tabled at least last year, does the same kind of thing. I mean, not in all the particulars that Nate is suggesting, which I think Nate's is a much more nuanced approach, but at least it suggests that the debate across the pond is very similar right now. So for example, everyone believes, like who's in this regulatory space in Brussels and people like Nate and others see transparency as a key goal, access to data, right? There's a convergence around issues pertaining to individual, data privacy, and how that can also be a tool to, to really put some pressure on the platforms and to put those rails on the platforms as well. I mean, there are other convergences. I think one of the things, and this goes back to something Jack was suggesting about how, maybe the way I would put it is, our debates in the United States often take place in an environment where we don't necessarily think about the implications of our actions for those around the world. And the intermediary liability debate is a really good one, because the intermediary liability debate is asking, to what extent should the platforms be held liable for the speech or the posts of their users and for their moderation, for their regulation of that speech? And Section 230, basically says they shouldn't be held liable for their good faith moderation. They're not publishers, so they're not the speakers. And when we think about the ways in which we might, and this is a big debate around, sort of carving out different elements from that, immunity from liability, I think we need to also be thinking about how will others around the world, particularly where you've got billions of users and really, authoritarian governments, how will they take the lessons or the models that we provide and use those in order to restrict speech in ways that is really about restricting legitimate, political expression and so forth. And the other part of it, and I'll end here, taking in mind your filibustering, your regular filibustering comment, is the fact that we also need to be careful about adopting rules that don't inadvertently reinforce the power of the platforms. I mean, we saw this in Germany when they adopted the Network Enforcement Act that imposes some, interesting transparency rules and so forth, but only some of the companies and the most dominant companies can really afford to do that. So in a weird way, it kind of reinforces their power and locks out new entries and prevents sort of the, the 50 Facebooks, let 50 Facebooks bloom kind of idea. So I'll stop there, but those are just some of my reactions to your question.
Thank you so much. And to stick with the metaphor of the filibuster, the advantage that I have over the majority leader in the Senate is I have a mute button here. Zephyr, you had a reaction to David's comments about intermediary liability.
Yeah, no, I just want to share what is the way that I would think about it, is that we have a whole suite of problems, but if you think there's a power problem and there's a business model problem, and we can solve the power problem without solving the business model problem, or we can solve the business model. So I think of 230 as reforming 230 as part of solving the business model problem, and should not be done instead of breakups. And so for 230, and several people have advocated for this, but I just want to be clear, the premise is that there is a platform. By the way, the word platform itself brings in a metaphor of flatness and evenness and neutrality. And we've just sort of stayed with the idea that it is a platform that then is modified. Right now, these are not acting like platforms. They're picking and choosing what content is promoted. And it's a sort of classic principle of tort law that you might not be responsible for things you don't do, but if you're going out there to, clean up the sidewalk and somebody slips, you've actively done something that caused their slippage and therefore you're liable. Here we have Facebook basically pouring ice on the sidewalk and still getting the immunity shield. So that the fix for 230 that I support is saying, if you promote, then you don't get you don't get the immunity. I don't think that stops targeted advertising, but I think it slows it down in a significant way in some of the most dangerous areas. And so that's a 230 fix that sort of fits in the box of the business model problem, in my view.
Thank you very much. And before we go into the Q&A, I would like to bring in Jack again. Jack, you're a scholar of the First Amendment. Many people have brought up the First Amendment as the ultimate filibuster against reform. Is that true? Are so many of these reforms really impossible on constitutional grounds, or is that misguided?
Well, it depends on which reform we're talking about. So I'll give you a quick list. Antitrust, generally not a First Amendment problem, because you're basically aiming at the structure of the industry. When you aim at the structure of the industry and when you require, generally speaking, that's not a First Amendment problem. You could make it into one, but generally that's not the problem. One of the reasons you want to use Section 230 as a lever to impose public interest obligations is that some of the public interest obligations you might offer would be First Amendment problems if you impose them directly. And if you do them as part of a bargain, then in fact, the question is whether they're an unconstitutional condition. It's much easier to succeed in those cases. And I'm totally with Nate, which is you're not going to have these public interest obligations for every company. You're only going to have them for very, very large companies. The vast majority of people who use Section 230 are not large companies. So you have very different policy considerations for those. With respect to privacy, well, the Supreme Court has been edging toward making it impossible to have comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States. As it stands right now, you can probably do it. But if they go any further than the direction which they've already gone, it's going to be almost impossible. One advantage of the fiduciary model that I pushed is that there is a tradition of treating fiduciaries as having a different set of rules apply to them, which escape certain kinds of First Amendment objections. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, if the Roberts Court keeps going in the direction it's going, it will be very difficult to do anything to counter the power of these large companies. But under existing First Amendment law, I think most of these reforms should be okay.
Can I say one thing about the politics of that, though, which is kind of interesting because we're seeing on the Supreme Court a kind of exception to their, it remains to be seen, but the antipathy that's clearly come out of some of the opinions from Justice Thomas and others toward the big tech companies might lead them to be a little more supportive of something that looks like it's a regulation of big tech than otherwise. And so I agree with everything that Jack said, but there is this kind of weird realpolitik that's going on behind the scenes at the Supreme Court when it comes to the platforms.
Yeah.
Thank you. David, you had already mentioned the potential impact of changes to the liability regime in the US on a global scale, basically. We had a couple questions in the chat asking about what antitrust remedies in the US might have for consequences in other jurisdictions. And maybe you can elaborate on that a bit.
It is such a great question. And I honestly don't know what the answer is, but I think that the antitrust discussion, and maybe Zephyr can talk about this as well, because she's thought about it for a long time and written a book about the issue. But, you know, one thing, it's actually interesting that, you know, this week has been, you know, it started on Sunday with 60 Minutes and Francis's appearance and sort of the focus on whistleblower. And then Monday opened up with Facebook and its family of apps all being down for many, many hours. And you know, my reaction to the apps being down, to Facebook being down, the whole outage, was that in some ways is more meaningful for the future of regulation around the world than the whistleblower stuff, because, you know, what it signaled was the total power of this one platform, particularly in environments where, you know, Facebook is the internet, but it's actually more than the internet in some ways. It's the communications network. And so WhatsApp, for example, is really the tool in much of the world that people use in order to communicate with one another. So my question, and this is really a question, I don't know the answer to this. My question about antitrust is, to the extent that an antitrust move in the United States moves forward, and you see, you know, WhatsApp being split apart from Instagram and Facebook, to what extent will that require WhatsApp to develop new models of raising money, of being profitable, so that it can be usable? And will it mean that for all the people who, I mean, truly cannot afford a kind of cell phone coverage, let's say, or a mobile plan, who are using WhatsApp instead, will that suddenly make WhatsApp unavailable to them? Again, I don't know the answer, but I think part of our evaluation, so, you know, as antitrust discussions move to, you know, hearings on the Hill and so forth, or in the FTC, I think part of the discussion should be, what would be the impact of this overseas? And if this is something we want to do because it's important for the United States, how do we mitigate the impact on users around the world who have, you know, come to rely so much on WhatsApp in particular?
Zephyr, you were going to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, what I take from that is something we haven't, I just think I mentioned in passing, but it's sort of a key argument for decentralization of these essential functions, is that it's really fragile. So when you have a banking system that can collapse, that is really dangerous. And when you have communications infrastructure that is essentially, you know, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook in this case, all integrated, that the collapse of one leads to the collapse of other, that actually is a fragile and dangerous situation. And we've seen this with, sort of the classic example is the earthquake in Japan that had massive impacts on the entire auto industry because we'd concentrated the manufacture of brakes in one area. So as a matter of safety and stability and the ability to communicate in crises, just as you want resilient food systems, one of the values that we should bring is a positive vision of resilience. And that, of course, is the idea of the web before it got taken over, is that it's the great virtue is the fundamental resilience, and there's a real danger in the direction that we have gone towards a non-resilient, breakable system.
Thank you very much. Nate, you had a point on WhatsApp.
Well, I just want to second what David had been saying about how the internet sort of functions and how the purposes these platforms serve, particularly in the global South, and that they end up spending so much of their time thinking about policy in Europe and in particularly the United States, since they're here, but only 10% of Facebook users live in the United States. And it has huge implications. And one other area, as we start thinking about what happens with the breakup, which I'm not against, is on the national security side and on the also on safety, right? So that WhatsApp has been able to sort of profit off its relationship with Facebook and Instagram and the huge security apparatus that they have, right? Because whether it's child endangerment or foreign interference with elections and the like, right? Facebook now rivals most governments in the world in terms of its kind of, intelligence service, as it were. And that's, of course, a problem, right? But if WhatsApp, as we know, is in some ways the chief arena for these problems in the developing world, well, then we need to make sure that whatever regulations that we impose here don't prevent them from addressing those problems because they've been hived off from Facebook.
Thank you very much. And I'm picking up a question from the Q&A here from Art Pericles. Question to Nate. You spoke on anonymity. Don't the Facebook files show that some bad behavior is dependent precisely on hyperconnectiveness, on context collapse, on too much identity performance rather than the opposite of it?
Yes, both of those things can be true at the same time, right? You could have problems with anonymity, which, anonymity is what gives us a lot of the hate speech problem, a lot of the unaccountable speech problem, particularly at women journalists, minority journalists who get attacked online from these online mobs and the like. A lot of it is through shielded anonymity. Now, of course, we are now living in a world where people can march through Charlottesville without hoods on. So it's not as if people are just being hateful when they're anonymous. But that is also what gives us the bot problem and the like, because it's going to become increasingly difficult for you to distinguish between a machine and a human being that you're talking to. Having said all that, right? Yes, it is in some ways, when people are performing on Instagram and the like, right? That leads to a whole nother set of problems, which is, that people put their unreal lives on Facebook and other platforms, and that causes people to be depressed and, fear of missing out and all of that, right? And some of the things that Frances Haugen was talking about in the previous panel. So both of those things can be true at the same time.
Thank you very much. Zephyr, you had a point on that? I'm sorry, misunderstood. I would like to move.
Wait, Nick, before we go on, I just want to say something about anonymity, because I agree with what Nate just said, but I don't want us to get into this position where we think that anonymity is the primary cause for all of the different ills. And I think Nate agrees with me. And I just to emphasize that some of the good, to the extent that there's good on, whether it's on the platforms or elsewhere on the internet, anonymity is a real tool for, sexual minorities and repressive societies, for individuals who are engaged in all sorts of political activism in difficult environments. And we don't want to throw that out while we're dealing with these other problems. And just as I think it was mentioned earlier, Section 230, there's a lot of ways to do regulation without dealing with Section 230. The same is true with anonymity. There are a lot of regulations that can be imposed, a lot of transparency and disclosure kinds of points that can be introduced without getting rid of the kind of anonymity that so many, activists and others around the world really rely upon.
Let me agree with that, because that's definitely right. And this is where the puzzle of the challenge comes in, which is how do you harness the benefits of anonymity, empowering dissidents, right? We don't want to return to a world where you have 3 white men on the evening news who are the ones who are deciding what everyone sees, right? And then, but at the same time, trying to figure out, how can you distinguish between good and bad anonymity, right? And we have to figure out a way to do that, right? How do you preserve the ability of dissidents, particularly in the conflict zones you're talking about, to be able to go up against authoritarian regimes and the like, while at the same time trying to mitigate against the dangers of irresponsible hate speech and the like.
Thank you very much. And I would like to pivot for the last 5 minutes a bit. We have talked a lot about substantive changes, substantive policy, substantive law. I'd like to talk a bit about institutions, and we have had questions in the chat on that. I'd like to bring in Jack. Jack, you had a whole list of reforms that you would like to see enacted. Who should enact those?
Well, the ones that I offered were all for states, for nation states in the European Union. The discussion in the first panel was a discussion about companies themselves. Also, here I'm going to make a plug for antitrust. I assume that Zephyr will be very pleased. If you do your industrial policy right, you actually get a lot of innovation by lots of different companies, which can be to the benefit of end users.
Thank you. And let's now move on this into the sub-nation state level. Zephyr, you have written plentiful on antitrust. Can you guide us a bit in terms of who would be the ones that actually enforce that? Maybe talk a bit about the FTC, but also potentially other institutions that could get us into a situation where we have a more open and a more competitive online environment.
Well, there's the FTC, the FCC, the states. These are the sort of key enforcers, along with the soon-to-be AAG for antitrust, I believe, Jonathan Cantor. But I do want to say that there was something really remarkable that Joe Biden did recently, which is he issued a sort of whole suite of requests and demands, depending on which agency we're talking about, for rulemaking on antitrust across the board. And I think what it helped do is open our imagination so that we understand that dealing with the real crisis of the rule of law and the crisis of concentration of power, which are related and very much related to being able to govern, decide what kind of social media we want, decide what kind of world we want to live in, are not just the purview of the agencies that we may typically think about, but are an ethos that can pervade every area. So I do think it's important to look at the FTC, FCC, AAG, and the states, and but also recognize the larger ethos, that we should embrace an ethos of one, breaking up extremely concentrated capital, and we're talking about extreme concentrations, and also embrace an ethos that I just want to return to that was in the first panel, which is we can have rules regarding business law, and we always have. I said this before, but I want to repeat it. We have had rules against multi-level marketing, rules against pyramid schemes, rules against gambling, all kinds of ways where we say you just can't make money this way because it's bad for society. And so to sort of, along with the traditional, re-embrace that we can innovate collectively in corporate law to protect ourselves, to have a safe society.
Thank you so much. We are coming to almost the end of our session. David, if you had only one wish, the fairy gives you only one wish for one legal change to implement tomorrow to make online discourse better, what would it be?
Wow, one wish. I need to sort of warm up the genie's bottle or something. I would go with some version of Nate's proposal for transparency. And I mean, I might expand it, but I think going the legal route right now and opening up the companies to transparency, to a range of different kinds of transparency, would be. I think that's an easy. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit for me of what we should be doing. There are many, many, many hard questions out there around disinformation, around hate speech, and so forth. But I think the first step is indeed opening up the companies to transparency.
Thank you very much. Nate, the ferry is cruel. The ferry doesn't allow you to pick your own proposal. What other proposal, what other legal change would you like to see implemented tomorrow?
Well, David Kaye is so smart that I just, second whatever he says. So it just happens to be self-interested here. Well, let me just say one thing, and I don't want to push it in a negative direction. But look, if you live in a society where 30% believe that the election was stolen or that vaccines are ineffective, right? You are going to continue to see that kind of discourse online in Facebook or wherever else. And we need to be sort of modest about because you asked the question, like to make healthier discourse. It's like, we've got really unhealthy discourse in this country and across many spheres, and that includes legacy media as well as social media. So I actually think that's going to be a very difficult problem to solve. But if we can figure out what these problems are by getting the data from inside the platforms, I think that's important. I'll since you want me to suggest something else, in the same vein, which is algorithmic auditing, really understanding, having some way of figuring out the impact of these algorithms, I think since that is, if you look at the common thread that came through in the testimony, so much of it was that there was tweaking that was leading to social harm in the algorithm. Well, we need some way of figuring out, basically to measure the smoke that's coming out of the tailpipe of the algorithms.
Thank you, Zephyr. Your wish.
Well, I feel like I should use the end of the panel to get into a fight, right? So just to leave something to chew on. I want Nate to have all the information in the world. And I am a big believer in transparency, but like the bones are broken. I want to have the x-ray, but I really want to caution against a low-hanging fruit approach, because I think we're at more of a crisis moment, and I think we know enough to act. And so, yes, we should learn, but as Tillich, we might as well bring a theologian, right? We're at the end of the session. As Tillich talks about, courage is knowing when to act and when to keep learning. And you have to do both at all times. I think we are at a moment of action, which doesn't mean we should stop learning, but that there is a real urgency because the level of pollution on the one hand and control on the other is too dangerous. So my wish is that Mark Zuckerberg is not the minister of truth, and that no man, no woman is the minister of truth and privacy in this country.
Thank you. The cruel fairy is happy because we're going to end in disagreement. Jack, your last wish.
My last wish is to thank you, Nick, for being an outstanding moderator, and to thank all the panelists, both in this panel and the previous panel, for really an extraordinary session. Thank you all very much.
The fairy is happy. Thank you so much to the fantastic panel. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. It was illuminating. It was wonderful. We had an incredible audience that contribute fascinating questions. If you ever feel like learning more about law, technology, speech online, check out the Information Society Project. Check us out on Twitter. Check out our website. Check out our work. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a good night.